My name is Margaret, and at 64, I believed I had already lived through everything life could throw at me. I thought I understood sacrifice. I thought I understood love. Most of all, I thought I understood my son. I was wrong. The morning I signed the final papers to sell my house, the pen felt heavier than it should have. It wasn't just ink on paper, it was 40 years of my life condensed into a signature. Every corner of that house carried a memory: scraped knees, birthday cakes, quiet nights spent worrying about bills I barely managed to pay. But I told myself this wasn't about the past. This was about the future. His future. Are you absolutely certain? The agent asked me, glancing over her glasses as if she expected me to change my mind at the last second. I've never been more certain, I replied, even though a strange unease twisted in my chest. I walked out of that office with a check that represented everything I had left in the world. And I didn't hesitate. I already knew where it was going. To Daniel, my son. The drive to his office felt longer than it actually was. I rehearsed what I would say over and over again. I imagined his reaction: surprise, gratitude, maybe even pride. After all, he was finally taking over the company his father had once built from nothing. A small logistics firm. Nothing glamorous, but it had fed us, clothed us, and carried us through years of uncertainty. After my husband left, I had held that business together with sheer willpower and exhaustion. Now it was Daniel's turn, or so I believed. When I arrived, the receptionist barely looked at me before pointing toward his office. Everything felt different, sleeker, colder, more modern than I remembered. Like the place had been redesigned to erase any trace of what it used to be. I knocked softly and stepped inside. Daniel didn't look up right away. "Mom, you didn't have to come all the way here," he said, still focused on his laptop. "You could have just transferred the money." The words hit me harder than they should have. "I wanted to see you," I said, forcing a small smile as I reached into my bag and pulled out the check. "This isn't just money, Daniel. It's everything I've saved." He took it, glanced at the number for less than a second, and placed it casually on his desk. "Thanks. This will help with the expansion." That was it.
No hook, no pause.
No understanding of what I had just given up. Just, thanks. I stood there, waiting for something more that never came. "I thought maybe I could help," I added carefully, "with the accounts or client relations. I know the business better than anyone." He leaned back slightly, sighing. "Mom, things are different now. We're scaling. We need professionals."
Professionals.
I nodded slowly, even though something inside me cracked. "I see. And besides," he added, "Clara's already handling most of that. She knows what she's doing."
Clara.
His wife. The woman who had entered our lives 3 years ago and somehow, quietly, steadily, pushed me out of every space I once occupied. I left his office feeling smaller than when I had walked in, but I told myself it was normal. Children grow up. They change. They build their own lives. That's what I kept repeating. 3 weeks later, the company hosted a formal event in a large hotel ballroom. Daniel called it a networking gala. I wasn't sure what that meant exactly, but I bought a new dress anyway. Simple, modest, something that wouldn't draw attention. I arrived early, hoping to feel useful. Instead, I felt invisible. People moved around me in tailored suits and expensive perfumes. Conversations flowed effortlessly: business deals, investments, future plans. I stood near the back, watching my son from a distance. He looked confident,
Polished.
like someone I barely recognized. Clara stood beside him, elegant and composed, guiding conversations with practiced ease. They looked like a perfect pair, a perfect team, a perfect future that, somehow, didn't include me. When Daniel finally stepped onto the stage, The room quieted instantly. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he began, his voice steady and assured. "This year marks a new chapter for the company." Applause followed. I clapped too, my chest tightening with a strange mix of pride and distance. "I'd like to thank everyone who made this possible," he continued. "Our team, our partners, and of course, our family." My heart lifted. "Mom," he said, scanning the room, "could you come up here?" For a moment I hesitated. Then I made my way forward, aware of every pair of eyes on me. This was it. Finally, recognition. When I reached him, he smiled, charming, practiced. "I want to thank my mother, Margaret, for her support over the years." He handed me a small wrapped item. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside was a single artificial flower, the kind you might pick up at a petrol station.
Cheap.
Lifeless. Meaningless. "It's beautiful," I said quietly, even though my throat tightened. Polite applause followed. And then, and now, Daniel continued, his energy suddenly rising, "I want to invite someone truly special." I stepped aside, still holding the flower. "Clara's mother," he said, "has been an incredible mentor to us. Her guidance has helped shape our vision." She walked onto the stage with effortless confidence. Daniel presented her with a velvet box. When she opened it, the room filled with gasps. A diamond necklace sparkled under the lights. Real. Expensive. Impossible to ignore. "This is just a small token of appreciation," he said. The applause this time was thunderous. People stood, smiled, celebrated. And I stood there, clutching a plastic flower worth less than a cup of coffee, watching my son honor someone who had been in his life for 3 years, while I had spent decades giving him everything. The room blurred. I stepped off the stage quietly, unnoticed. In the restroom, I stared at my reflection under harsh lighting. I looked tired, not just physically, but deeply, completely tired. When did I become invisible? I whispered to myself. No answer came, but something shifted inside me. Not anger, not yet. Something colder, clearer. When I returned to the hall, I didn't go back inside immediately. Instead, I stood near the entrance, holding that ridiculous flower. For the first time in years, I stopped making excuses for him, stopped explaining his behavior away, stopped telling myself that love looked like this. And in that moment, I understood something I should have realized long ago. I had given my entire life to someone who no longer saw my worth. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop giving. That night, I didn't go straight back to the small apartment I had rented across town. Instead, I sat in my car for a long time, the engine off, my hands resting on the steering wheel while the silence pressed in around me. The artificial flower lay on the passenger seat, its bright color almost mocking under the dim streetlight. I kept staring at it, as if I could somehow make it mean something more than it did. But the truth was simple, and I could no longer avoid it. This was exactly what I had been reduced to in my son's life. A polite gesture, something symbolic, something cheap. I eventually drove to the house that was no longer mine. The new owners hadn't moved in yet, and for a moment I just sat outside, looking at the windows, remembering what it had once been. That house wasn't just a building. It was where everything had happened, where Daniel had taken his first steps, where I had stayed up night after night trying to figure out how to stretch money that never seemed enough, where I had promised a little boy that no matter what happened, I would always be there for him. He had been 7 when his father left. I remember that day with painful clarity, like a photograph that never fades. I came home from work and found a note on the kitchen table. No explanation beyond a few selfish lines about needing something different, something more. 20 years of marriage reduced to a paragraph. I didn't even have time to process it before Daniel came into the room, holding one of his toy cars, asking where his father was. I lied, of course. I told him it was work, something temporary. Because what kind of mother tells her child that his father simply chose to leave? From that moment on, it was just the two of us. And I made a decision that shaped everything that followed. I would never let him feel abandoned. I worked at the bank during the day, handling accounts and numbers that never belonged to me, and at night I cleaned offices downtown. Daniel would sit in empty meeting rooms doing his homework while I vacuumed carpets and wiped down desks. Sometimes he fell asleep on those stiff office couches, and I would carry him out to the car, his small arms wrapped loosely around my neck, trusting me completely. I remember once, when he was about 10, he asked me why I worked so much. I told him it was so he could have a better life, so he could go to university, so he wouldn't have to struggle the way I did. He accepted that answer so easily back then. Children believe what you tell them. They don't question sacrifice. They simply grow inside it. As he got older, it became clear he had a talent for numbers. His teachers noticed it first. They told me he had potential, real potential, and that he could do something meaningful if he had the right opportunities. But opportunities cost money, and money was something I never had enough of. So, I found more work. Weekends, bookkeeping for small businesses. Early mornings, late nights, constant exhaustion. I told myself it was temporary, that one day it would all be worth it. When he got into university, I cried. Not because I was sad, but because I felt like I had finally done something right. Even though the scholarship didn't cover everything, I found a way. Loans, extra shifts, selling things I didn't really want to part with. And when I dropped him off on campus, he hugged me tightly and promised he would make it all worth it. He said he would take care of me one day. I believed him. But somewhere during those years, something changed. His calls became shorter, less frequent. His tone shifted in a way I couldn't quite explain at first. And then he brought Clara home. From the moment I met her, I felt it, that quiet, almost invisible tension. She was polite, always smiling, always saying the right things, but there was something underneath it. A kind of assessment, like she was evaluating everything around her. The house, the furniture, me. She came from a different world, educated parents, comfortable upbringing, conversations about investments and strategies instead of survival and endurance. She didn't say anything outright at first, but her influence showed in small ways. Suggestions about how the business could be improved, comments about outdated systems, remarks about how things were done nowadays. Daniel listened to her in a way he had never listened to me, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, I began to disappear from his decision-making. After they married, the distance grew. Weekly dinners turned into occasional visits. Phone calls became brief check-ins. And every time I tried to offer advice or help, I was gently, politely dismissed. There was always a better way, a newer way, a more professional approach. I told myself it was just a phase. Until the night he called me about the expansion. He sounded excited, full of ambition. He talked about growth, about doubling profits, about turning the company into something bigger than it had ever been. And then he mentioned the investment. 50,000. He didn't ask directly. He framed it as an opportunity, something that could help accelerate everything.
I didn't hesitate.
I didn't ask questions. I didn't protect myself. I simply gave, because that's what I had always done. And now, sitting in front of the house that no longer belonged to me, I finally saw it clearly. It hadn't been a sudden change. It had been happening for years. Little by little, step by step, I had been moved out of my own life. Not with cruelty, not with anger, but with indifference. And somehow, that hurt more. I picked up the flower from the passenger seat and held it in my hands. It was perfectly shaped, perfectly preserved, completely lifeless.
No sentem, no softness, no fragilite.
It would never wilt, never change, never grow.
Just like the way my son saw me now.
Something fixed. Something finished. Something no longer needed. I leaned back in the seat and closed my eyes, letting the realization settle fully for the first time. The pain was still there, sharp and undeniable, but beneath it was something new. Something steady. Understanding. For years, I had defined myself by what I could give, by how much I could endure, by how far I could go for someone else. I had built my identity around sacrifice, around being needed. But what happens when the person you gave everything to decides they no longer need you? You either disappear, or you redefine yourself. That night, sitting alone in a car outside a house filled with memories, I made a decision I didn't fully understand yet. I wasn't going to disappear. And for the first time in a very long time, that thought didn't scare me. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, though I hadn't really slept. My mind had been too busy replaying every detail from the night before: the stage, the applause, the necklace, the flower. But something inside me felt different. The heaviness was still there, but it had shifted, like a fog beginning to lift. I made myself a cup of coffee in the small kitchen of my apartment and sat by the window, staring out at the quiet street below. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about what Daniel needed, what the company needed, or what I should sacrifice next. I was thinking about what I needed to understand. By mid-morning, I found myself walking into an office I hadn't visited in months, the office of Edward Clark, my lawyer. He had been part of my life for decades, long before Daniel ever stepped into the business. He knew the history, the truth behind everything that had been built and everything that had been lost. When I walked in, he looked up from his desk and immediately noticed something had changed. "Margaret," he said, standing up slowly, concern in his eyes. "You look different." "I think I finally see things clearly," I replied, taking a seat across from him. My voice sounded calm, almost unfamiliar to my own ears. He studied me for a moment before nodding. "Then tell me what happened."
So I did.
I told him everything from selling the house, to giving Daniel the money, to the event, the flower, the necklace, and the moment I realized just how invisible I had become. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I simply laid out the facts, one after another, as if I were finally reading a story I had been too emotionally involved in to understand before. When I finished, Edward leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "And what do you want to do now?" The question lingered in the air longer than I expected. For so many years, my decisions had been automatic, guided by obligation, by love, by habit. But now I had to actually think. "I want to understand what's mine," I said finally. A small, almost knowing smile appeared on his face. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a thick folder, placing it carefully on the desk between us. "Then it's time you look at this again." I recognized the documents immediately. The original company papers. The ones Daniel had never bothered to review properly. The ones I hadn't insisted he understand. "Margaret," Edward continued, his tone steady, "you never transferred ownership of the company." I frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "Daniel has been running it for months." "Running it is not the same as owning it," he replied. "Legally, you still hold a majority stake." The words didn't fully register at first. I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. "That's not possible. He talks about the company like it's his." "He talks about it that way," Edward said carefully, "because no one ever corrected him. But the legal structure hasn't changed. You stepped back operationally, yes. But ownership? That remained entirely yours." A strange silence filled the room. For a moment, I felt almost disoriented, like the ground beneath me had shifted in an unexpected way. All this time, I had believed I was handing something over, giving him control, trusting him to lead. But in reality, I had never actually given up the authority that came with it. "So you're telling me," I said slowly, That Daniel has been acting like the owner of a company that still belongs to me? Exactly. I let out a quiet breath, leaning back in my chair. The irony of it was almost too much. The same son who had dismissed me, who had treated me like an outsider, had been doing so while standing inside something that legally, undeniably, was still mine. Edward opened the folder and began laying out documents. There's more. The money you gave him, the 50,000. That wasn't a gift, Margaret. Not in the way you think. You insisted on documenting it, remember? I blinked, trying to recall. And then it came back to me. A brief moment of hesitation before handing over the check. A quiet suggestion from Edward that I protect myself, just in case. I had agreed, almost absent-mindedly, not expecting it to matter. It was structured as a loan, he continued, with terms, with conditions, legally binding. I stared at the papers in front of me. Everything was there, clear and precise. My signature, the agreement, the expectations. And he knows this? I asked. Edward shook his head. He signed it, but I doubt he truly understood it, or took it seriously. Of course he didn't. Why would he? In his mind, I had already become irrelevant. Edward hesitated for a moment before pulling out another set of documents. His expression grew more serious. There's something else you need to see. As I looked over the financial statements, a cold feeling settled in my chest. The numbers didn't lie. Expenses had increased sharply. Revenue hadn't kept up. There were transactions that didn't make sense. Large amounts spent on things that had nothing to do with actual business growth. What is this? I asked quietly. Spending, Edward said. Significant spending. Some of it labeled as business development, but questionable. I scanned the pages more carefully. Restaurants, hotels, luxury purchases. And then I saw it. A charge that made my stomach drop. A jewelry purchase. The exact amount. The necklace. For Clara's mother. My fingers tightened around the paper. For a moment, I couldn't speak. The image of that stage flashed in my mind again. Her standing there, smiling, admired, celebrated. And now I knew. It hadn't just been expensive. It had been paid for by the company. By my company. This wasn't a gift, I said, my voice low. This was misuse. Edward nodded. It appears that way. I felt something shift inside me again, but this time it wasn't just clarity. It was resolve. Not emotional, not reactive, something steadier, something grounded in fact rather than feeling. He's not just disrespecting me, I said slowly. He's putting the entire business at risk. Edward didn't respond immediately, but his silence was agreement enough. If this continues, he added, the company could face serious financial trouble within months. Months. After everything it had survived. After everything I had done to keep it alive. I closed the folder and sat back, letting the weight of it settle. For years, I had told myself that stepping back was the right thing, that giving Daniel space to lead was part of letting him grow. But this wasn't growth. This was recklessness disguised as ambition. What are my options? I asked. Edward's voice was calm, professional. As majority owner, you have full authority to intervene. You can review all financial decisions, implement controls, or resume active management immediately. The words felt heavy, but not overwhelming. For the first time, I wasn't thinking like a mother trying to protect her son. I was thinking like someone who had built something and wasn't willing to watch it be destroyed. And if I do nothing? I asked. Edward met my gaze. Then you risk losing everything you spent your life building. Silence settled between us again. I thought about the years of work, the exhaustion, the sacrifices. I thought about the house I had sold, the money I had given, the way I had been treated. And then I thought about the future. Not Daniel's. Meaning. I want to call a meeting, I said finally. Edward raised an eyebrow slightly. A formal one? Yes, I replied. No more informal conversations. No more assumptions. He nodded slowly, a hint of approval in his expression. Then we'll do it properly. As I stood to leave, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Not anger, not sadness. Power. Not the kind that controls others, but the kind that comes from finally understanding your own position. Daniel believed he was in charge. Clara believed I was irrelevant. They were both about to learn how wrong they were. And this time, I wasn't going to stay silent. By the time Thursday arrived, the weather matched the tension I felt. Low gray clouds, a steady drizzle, the kind that soaked into everything without making a sound. I dressed carefully that morning, more deliberately than I had in years. Not for appearance, but for clarity. A dark navy suit I used to wear to important meetings, a silk blouse, simple pearl earrings. Nothing extravagant, nothing soft either. I didn't want to look like someone's mother. I wanted to look like exactly what I was. The owner. When I arrived at the office, I didn't hesitate at the entrance the way I had before. I didn't feel like a guest anymore. I walked in with quiet certainty, acknowledging the receptionist with a nod as I passed. The conference room had already been prepared. Edward sat at the table, documents arranged neatly in front of him, 3 identical folders placed with precise intention. He looked up when I entered, studying my expression for a brief moment before giving a small, approving nod. "You're ready," he said. "I am," I replied, and for the first time, I knew it was true. Daniel arrived exactly on time. Clara walked in right behind him, her posture confident, her eyes immediately scanning the room, taking in Edward, the documents, the formal arrangement. I watched the subtle shift in her expression, just for a second, before she composed herself again. Daniel looked slightly confused, but not concerned.
Not yet.
"Mom," he said, pulling out a chair, "I still don't understand why we needed to make this so official." "Because this isn't informal anymore," I replied calmly, taking my seat. "This is business." Clara leaned forward slightly. "With all due respect, Margaret, this feels unnecessary. We could have discussed any concerns privately." I met her gaze without hesitation. "We've had plenty of private conversations. They didn't change anything." There was a brief silence. Edward cleared his throat and opened one of the folders, sliding copies toward Daniel and Clara. "Let's begin with the company's ownership structure," he said. I watched Daniel's face as he looked down at the documents. At first it was confusion, then disbelief. Then something sharper, something closer to panic. "I don't understand," he said slowly. "This says you own 60% of the company." "That's correct," I replied. That can't be right," Clara said quickly, reaching for the papers. "You stepped away. You retired." "I stepped away from daily operations," I said evenly. "I never transferred ownership." Daniel looked back at me, searching my face for something, maybe reassurance, maybe denial, but I gave him neither. "So all this time," he began, his voice trailing off. "Yes," I said. "All this time." The room grew heavier. The balance had shifted, and for the first time, they both felt it. Edward opened another folder. "Now that ownership has been clarified, we can move on to financial oversight." Daniel sat back in his chair, his posture tightening. "What exactly is this about?" "It's about accountability," I answered. Edward laid out the financial reports across the table, each page precise, organized, undeniable. "Numbers don't argue. They don't soften the truth. Over the past 6 months," he explained, "company expenditures have increased significantly, while revenue has remained largely unchanged." Clara crossed her arms. "That's called investment. Growth requires spending. Investment requires strategy," Edward replied calmly. These expenses don't reflect that. I leaned forward slightly, placing my hand on one of the reports. Daniel, can you explain these charges? He glanced down, then back at me. They're business expenses. Client meetings, networking, development. Which clients? I asked. He hesitated. Edward spoke instead. We've reviewed the records. Many of these expenses involve no external clients at all. Clara's tone sharpened. That doesn't mean they weren't necessary. Relationship building isn't always immediate. I slid one page forward, tapping a specific line. What about this? Daniel followed my finger. His expression shifted instantly. The jewelry purchase. The necklace. For Clara's mother. That, he began, then stopped. That was a gesture of appreciation, Clara said quickly. My mother has provided valuable guidance. Your mother, I said calmly, has no official role in this company. She's contributed ideas. She is not an employee, not a consultant, and not part of the board, Edward interrupted. Company funds cannot be used for personal gifts. The silence that followed was sharp and uncomfortable. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. It was a mistake. We can reimburse it. It's not just the necklace, I said. It's a pattern. Edward laid out more documents, restaurant bills, hotel stays, expenses labeled vaguely enough to pass at a glance, but not under scrutiny. In total, he continued, spending has increased by nearly 40%. Clara shook her head. You're focusing on the wrong metrics. Growth takes time. Growth, I replied, does not mean draining resources without results. Daniel looked between us, clearly struggling. We're building something bigger. You just don't see it yet. No, I said quietly. I see it very clearly. The room went still. You're spending money the company doesn't have, I continued, and you're doing it without accountability. Clara stood abruptly. This is ridiculous. We don't have to sit here and be interrogated. Sit down, I said. I didn't raise my voice, but something in my tone made her pause. Slowly, reluctantly, she sat back down. This meeting isn't over, I added. Daniel swallowed hard. What are you saying, Mom? I took a breath, not to steady myself, but to ensure there was no hesitation in what came next. I'm saying that effective immediately, I am resuming full oversight of the company. The words landed heavily. All expenditures above a fixed amount will require my approval. Company accounts will be reviewed regularly, and any personal use of company funds will be corrected immediately. Clara stared at me, disbelief turning into anger. You can't do that. I can, I replied. Edward nodded. As majority owner, she has full authority. Daniel leaned forward, his voice quieter now. Are you taking the company away from me? For a moment, I saw something familiar in his expression. Not the businessman, not the confident speaker from the stage. My son. But I didn't let that change my answer. I'm taking responsibility for what was always mine, I said. That's not fair, he said. I've been running this. And I trusted you to do it responsibly. His gaze dropped. Clara stood again, this time not stopping. This is exactly why family businesses fail. Emotion instead of logic. I stood as well, meeting her at eye level. No, I said. They fail when people confuse entitlement with ownership. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Daniel didn't move. He just sat there, staring at the documents, at the evidence, at the reality he hadn't expected. As the meeting ended, Edward began collecting the papers, calm and efficient. I walked toward the door, then paused. Daniel, I said without turning around, this isn't punishment. It's consequence. He didn't answer. When I stepped outside, the rain had slowed to a light mist. The air felt different, cleaner somehow. The conversation had been difficult, painful even, but it had been necessary, because for the first time in years, I had chosen myself. The first few days after the meeting were almost too quiet, and that silence unsettled me more than any argument could have. I expected resistance, anger, maybe even open confrontation, but instead Daniel became careful. He sent reports on time, responded to emails formally, and attended every scheduled discussion without a single complaint. On the surface, it looked like cooperation, but I knew my son well enough to recognize what it really was: a pause, not acceptance. Clara, on the other hand, disappeared from the office almost entirely. Her absence was noticeable, like a missing note in a song that suddenly sounded incomplete, but also less tense. I spent those first days reviewing everything. Not casually, not emotionally, but thoroughly. Every expense, every contract, every decision that had been made since Daniel took control. It was exhausting, but not in the way my old life had been. This wasn't physical exhaustion from working endless hours just to survive. This was something sharper, mental clarity mixed with the steady realization that I had been right to step in when I did. The deeper I looked, the more patterns revealed themselves. Overspending justified as growth, vague strategies with no measurable outcomes, decisions influenced more by image than substance. It wasn't just mismanagement, it was inexperience disguised as confidence. By Friday evening, I was sitting at the small table in my apartment, surrounded by neatly stacked papers, when my phone rang. Clara's name appeared on the screen. I stared at it for a moment before answering. Her voice, when I picked up, was soft, almost pleasant, but I had learned enough by now to recognize the difference between kindness and calculation. "Margaret," she said, "I was hoping we could talk." "I'm listening," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "I think things have gotten a bit out of hand," she continued. "This situation with the company, it's creating unnecessary tension. Daniel is under a lot of pressure, and honestly, I think this could all be resolved if we approached it differently." I leaned back in my chair, already understanding where this was going. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "I think you've made your point," she said smoothly. "You've shown that you have authority. But maybe now it's time to step back again and let Daniel continue leading. He needs the freedom to make decisions, to grow the business without feeling controlled." There it was. Not an apology, not accountability, a request to return things to the way they had been. "Controlled," I repeated quietly. "Is that how he describes oversight?" "He feels like he can't breathe," she replied. "Like every decision is being questioned. Every decision is being reviewed," I corrected. "There's a difference." She exhaled softly, as if dealing with someone unreasonable. "Margaret, you have to understand, business isn't what it used to be. It requires risk, bold moves, sometimes spending money before you see results. And sometimes," I said calmly, "it requires discipline." There was a brief pause, and when she spoke again, the softness in her voice had thinned slightly. "You're focusing too much on details. The bigger picture is growth. A 7,000-pound necklace is not a detail," I replied. Silence. Then, sharper now, "That was an investment in relationships." "No," I said. "It was a personal gift paid for by company funds." The shift in her tone was immediate. The politeness dropped, replaced by something colder. "If you keep pushing like this, you're going to destroy your relationship with your son." I let the words settle for a moment before responding. "If my relationship with my son depends on me ignoring irresponsible behavior, then perhaps it was already broken." "That's not fair," she said. "Family is supposed to support each other." "I agree," I replied, "which is why I supported him for decades. Financially, emotionally, completely." "Tell me, Clara, when exactly did that support stop being enough?" She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was no longer soft. You're being emotional. No, I said quietly. I'm being precise. Another pause. Then she spoke again, this time without any attempt to soften her words. Daniel has opportunities beyond this company. He doesn't have to stay somewhere he's constantly undermined. That caught my attention. Not because it surprised me, but because it confirmed something I had already begun to suspect. If he wants to leave, I said, he's free to do so. You just let him walk away? She asked. I wouldn't be letting him do anything, I replied. He would be making a choice. And the company? She pressed. The company will continue, I said simply. She let out a short, humorless laugh. You really think you can run it without him? I did before, I answered. I can again. The silence that followed was different this time, not strategic, not controlled.
Tense.
You're making a mistake, she said finally. And when this all falls apart, don't say I didn't warn you. The line went dead. I sat there for a moment, staring at my phone, but I didn't feel shaken. If anything, I felt confirmed. That conversation hadn't been about resolution. It had been about pressure, about pushing me back into a role where I was easier to manage. And I wasn't going back. The next few days passed with the same quiet tension. Daniel remained professional, distant, almost cautious in his interactions with me. There was no confrontation, no emotional outburst, just a careful distance that felt more deliberate than natural. It was as if he was trying to figure out his next move without revealing it. Then, on Monday morning, Edward called. His tone was different immediately. Margaret, he said, we need to talk. Something in his voice made my chest tighten slightly. What happened? I received legal notice this morning, he said. Daniel and Clara have hired representation. I closed my eyes briefly, letting the words settle. I had expected resistance. I just hadn't expected it to escalate this quickly. On what grounds? I asked. They're challenging your authority over the company, he replied, claiming that your recent actions are driven by personal motives rather than legitimate business concerns. I let out a slow breath. That's not surprising. There's more, he added, his tone growing heavier. They're also questioning your capacity to make decisions. That stopped me. My capacity, I repeated. They're suggesting that your judgment may be impaired, that your actions are irrational. For a moment, I didn't respond. Not because I didn't understand, but because I did.
Perfectly.
They're trying to remove me, I said quietly. Yes, Edward confirmed. Legally. I opened my eyes and stared at the wall in front of me. The situation had shifted again, but this time, it wasn't just business. This was personal, deeply personal. What do we do? I asked. We prepare, he said. We document everything, your decisions, the financial evidence, your involvement, your clarity. We show that your actions are not only rational, but necessary. I nodded slowly, even though he couldn't see me. And if they push this further? Then we meet them in court. After the call ended, I sat in silence for a long time. The room felt smaller somehow, or maybe the situation had just become larger. My own son, questioning my competence, trying to prove that I was no longer capable of making decisions. It hurt.
Of course it did.
But the pain wasn't overwhelming this time.
It was clarifying.
Because now there was no misunderstanding left.
No illusions.
No room for doubt. This wasn't just about control of a company.
It was about respect.
And I finally understood something I should have learned years ago. Respect isn't given because of love. It's proven through actions. And if someone chooses to take it away, you don't beg for it back. You stand your ground. The legal process began faster than I expected, as if everything that had been building quietly beneath the surface was now rushing forward all at once. Within days, documents were filed, statements prepared, timelines outlined. Edward moved with calm precision, guiding me through each step, explaining what would happen next, what would be asked of me, what they were trying to prove. I listened carefully, absorbing everything, but there was a strange sense of distance in me, as if I were watching my own life unfold from the outside. The situation was serious, even painful, but it no longer felt chaotic. It felt inevitable. They were building a narrative. That much was clear. According to their claim, I was acting out of emotion, unable to accept change, interfering in a modern business environment I didn't understand. They painted me as controlling, outdated, unstable. Not openly cruel, not obviously malicious, just subtly incapable. It was clever in a way. Not an attack, but a quiet erosion of credibility. But facts don't erode. And I had facts. Edward and I spent long hours preparing. Every financial record was reviewed again, every expense categorized, every decision explained in clear, objective terms. There was no exaggeration, no dramatics, just truth, laid out methodically. The misuse of company funds, the unexplained spending, the absence of measurable growth. It wasn't a matter of opinion. It was documented reality. What I hadn't expected was support from inside the company itself. Janet, the bookkeeper who had been with us for over 15 years, asked to speak with Edward privately. I remembered her as quiet, reliable, someone who rarely inserted herself into conflict. When she came into the office, she looked nervous, but determined. "I've been keeping copies," she said, placing a folder on the table. Edward raised an eyebrow. "Copies of what?" "Everything," she replied. "Transactions, receipts, internal notes." I didn't feel right about some of the spending. And the way decisions were being made, it didn't match how things used to work. I watched her carefully. "Why didn't you say anything earlier?" She hesitated, then answered honestly. "Because I wasn't sure how. And because things changed. The atmosphere. It didn't feel like a place where my concerns would matter." Her words stayed with me longer than I expected. Edward opened the folder and began reviewing the contents. As he flipped through the pages, his expression grew more focused. "This is extremely useful," he said. "You've documented a pattern." Janet nodded. "I just wanted to make sure someone knew the truth." The truth. It was simple, but powerful.
And it was enough.
The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. The sky was overcast again, as if the weather had decided to mirror the tension of the moment. I arrived early, dressed the same way I had for the board meeting. Calm, composed, deliberate. Edward was already there, reviewing final notes, but when he saw me, he closed the folder. "You don't need to memorize anything," he said. "Just be clear. Be honest." "I will," I replied. Inside the courtroom, everything felt quieter than I expected. Not peaceful, but controlled.
Structured.
Predictable in a way that life rarely is. Daniel sat across from me, his posture stiff, his expression carefully neutral. Clara sat beside him, composed as always, but I could see the tension in her jaw, the slight tightness around her eyes. For the first time, they didn't look confident. They looked prepared, but not certain. When the proceedings began, their attorney spoke first. His tone was measured, professional, presenting their case as a concern rather than an accusation. He spoke about generational differences, about evolving business practices, about the emotional complexity of family involvement in corporate structures. And then, gradually, he introduced the idea that my actions were not purely rational, that they were influenced by personal feelings, by difficulty letting go, by an inability to adapt. It was subtle, carefully constructed, but I recognized it for what it was. Edward responded with something far simpler.
Facts.
He presented the financial records, the documented expenditures, the inconsistencies, the misuse of company funds. He didn't argue emotionally.
He didn't attack.
He simply showed what had happened, step by step, number by number. And then came the moment I had been preparing for.
Daniel was called to speak.
I watched him as he stood, as he took his place, as he tried to hold onto the confidence he had worn so easily just weeks before. But this wasn't a stage. There was no applause here. No audience to impress. Only truth. He was asked about my decision-making, about my involvement, about my capacity. At first, he tried to stay consistent with their argument. He spoke about control, about tension, about how my oversight had made things more difficult. But when pressed for specifics, his answers began to falter. Can you provide an example of a decision your mother made that caused financial harm to the company? The judge asked. Daniel hesitated. No, he said finally. Has she implemented any policies that negatively impacted operations? Another pause.
No.
Has her involvement resulted in any measurable losses?
Silence.
And then, quietly, no. I didn't feel satisfaction. I didn't feel victory. I felt something else. Recognition. For the first time in this entire process, Daniel was being forced to confront reality, not through emotion, not through influence, but through fact. Clara's expression remained composed, but I could see the shift. The certainty she once carried was no longer absolute. When Janet's documentation was introduced, the impact was immediate. The pattern was clear. The decisions, the spending, the influence, it was all there, detailed and undeniable. There was no way to dismiss it as misunderstanding or exaggeration. The narrative they had built began to unravel. Not dramatically. Quietly.
Completely.
The decision came faster than I expected. The court ruled in my favor. Not just on authority, but on justification. My actions were deemed reasonable, necessary, and supported by evidence. The attempt to challenge my competence was dismissed without hesitation. It was over, at least legally. As I walked out of the courtroom, I expected to feel relief, maybe even triumph. But what I felt instead was stillness, a kind of quiet that settles after something irreversible has happened. Daniel caught up with me outside. "Mom," he said, his voice unsteady. I stopped, but I didn't turn immediately. When I did, I saw something I hadn't seen in a long time. Not confidence, not defensiveness, uncertainty. "I didn't think it would go this far," he said. I studied him for a moment before responding. "It didn't have to." He looked down briefly, then back at me. I thought you were trying to control everything. That you didn't trust me." "And now?" I asked. He hesitated. "I think I didn't understand what I was doing," he said quietly. I nodded once. "That's true," I replied. The honesty surprised him. "I made mistakes," he added. "Yes," I said. We stood there in silence for a moment, the weight of everything between us. Not just the court case, but years of distance, of decisions, of choices made and consequences faced. "I'm sorry," he said finally. The words were simple, but they weren't enough.
Not yet.
"I believe you," I said calmly. "But understanding what you did is only the beginning." He nodded slowly. "I know." I looked at him, not as the little boy I had raised, not as the man who had stood against me, but as someone in between, someone who had made choices and now had to live with them.
"This changes things," I said.
"I know," he repeated, and for the first time I think he truly did. I turned and walked away, not because I didn't care, but because I finally understood something important. Love doesn't mean accepting everything, and forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. 6 months after the court ruling, my life looked nothing like it had before, and for the first time in decades, that didn't frighten me. In fact, it felt right. The company, despite everything, had stabilized under my oversight, but something inside me had changed too deeply for things to simply return to what they had been. Every time I walked into that office, I could feel the history in the walls, not just the years of hard work and sacrifice, but also the tension, the betrayal, the slow unraveling of something I had once believed was unbreakable. It became clear to me that holding on to the business wasn't the same as holding on to its meaning. And meaning, I realized, matters more. The decision to sell didn't come all at once. It grew quietly over weeks, maybe months, like a thought that keeps returning until you finally listen to it. I began to understand that I wasn't obligated to carry everything I had built forever. Just because I had sacrificed for it didn't mean I had to be tied to it for the rest of my life. There was a difference between preserving something and being trapped by it. And I had spent too many years trapped by responsibility to recognize that I was allowed to choose something different. When I told Daniel, we were sitting in the same conference room where everything had shifted between us. He listened without interrupting, his posture still, his expression unreadable at first. "You're really going to sell it?" he asked finally. "Yes," I replied. "It's time." He nodded slowly, as if trying to process not just the decision, but everything it represented. "And what about everything we built?" I held his gaze. "We built it so it could survive, not so it could own us." He didn't argue. That, more than anything, told me how much had changed. The process took 3 months, longer than I expected, but smoother than I had feared. The buyer was a larger firm, structured, experienced, capable of taking the company further than either Daniel or I could at that point. They valued its reputation, its history, its stability. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like what I had created was being recognized properly, not dismissed, not overlooked, but respected. Daniel stayed involved during the transition. Without Clara's constant presence, she had grown distant after the court case, more focused on her own world than on the business. He seemed different, quieter, more thoughtful. He asked questions instead of assuming answers. He listened. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough for me to notice. Still, things between us were not what they had been, and I no longer expected them to be. On the final day, as we cleared out our offices, Daniel stood by the window for a long moment before speaking. "What will you do now?" he asked. I paused, considering the question more seriously than I would have in the past. "I'm going to live," I said. He glanced at me, a faint, almost uncertain smile appearing. "You weren't living before?" "I was surviving," I replied. "There's a difference." The cottage by the lake wasn't something I had planned. It was something I found, or maybe something that found me. Small, quiet, surrounded by water and trees instead of noise and obligation. The first night I spent there, I expected to feel loneliness, maybe even regret. Instead, I felt something I hadn't felt in years.
Peace.
Real peace, not the kind that comes from exhaustion, but the kind that comes from absence.
No expectations. No demands.
No constant calculation of what someone else needs from you. For the first time since I was a young woman, my time belonged entirely to me. I began slowly. Morning walks by the water. Coffee, without rushing. Books I had never had time to read. I joined a small local group that met weekly, nothing important, nothing strategic, just people sharing stories and ideas. I took a class in pottery, something I had never imagined doing, and found that I enjoyed working with my hands in a way that had nothing to do with necessity. Days passed differently there, not measured by productivity, but by presence. Daniel called occasionally. At first, the conversations were short, careful, almost formal. We spoke about practical things, his work, my new routine, neutral topics that didn't require us to revisit the past. Clara's name stopped coming up entirely. I didn't ask about her, and he didn't offer anything. I heard the truth from my sister instead. "They're not doing well," she told me one afternoon. Too much changed too quickly. I listened, but I didn't react. There was a time when I would have felt responsible for that, when I would have tried to fix it, to help, to intervene. But I had learned something important. Not everything is yours to repair. And sometimes, stepping back is the only way to truly move forward. It was a rainy evening when Daniel showed up at my door without warning. I recognized something in the way he stood there before he even spoke. Shoulders slightly lowered, expression uncertain. Not defeated, but no longer certain of himself in the way he once had been. "Mom," he said quietly, "can we talk?" I stepped aside and let him in without a word. We sat at the small table near the window, the sound of rain steady against the glass. I made coffee out of habit, placed a cup in front of him, and waited. I had learned that silence often reveals more than questions. After a long moment, he spoke. "We're getting divorced," he said. I nodded once. Not surprised. Not relieved either. Just aware. "I didn't see it before," he continued. "Or maybe I didn't want to." "That happens," I said. He looked at me carefully. "You're not going to say anything else?" "What would you like me to say?" I asked. He hesitated. "I don't know. I just thought that I would tell you everything will be fine." I finished. He gave a small, tired smile. "Something like that." I shook my head slightly. "You don't need that from me." He looked down at his hands. "I treated you badly." "Yes," I said. The honesty made him pause, but he didn't look away. "I thought I was building something," he continued. "I thought I knew what I was doing, but I wasn't paying attention to what I was losing." "No," I agreed. "You weren't." The rain filled the silence between us again. "I'm sorry," he said finally. This time, I didn't respond immediately. Not because I doubted him, but because I wanted to answer honestly. "I believe you," I said after a moment. "But apologies don't erase actions." He nodded slowly. "I know. And I'm not the same person I was before," I added. "I won't go back to that version of myself." "I'm not asking you to," he said. That mattered. More than the apology. We sat there for a while longer, not trying to fix anything, not pretending things were simple. Just existing in the same space, without expectations. "Can we try again?" he asked eventually. I looked at him carefully. "Not again," I said. "Something new." He seemed to consider that, then nodded. "I can do that." "Then start by standing on your own," I said. "Build something without relying on what someone else gives you." "I will," he replied. And for the first time in a long time, I believed he might. Over the following months, things changed slowly, the way real change always does. Daniel found work on his own, something smaller, less impressive on the surface, but more grounded. He didn't ask for help. He didn't expect shortcuts. He showed up, consistently, quietly rebuilding something, not a company this time, but himself. Our relationship grew carefully, without pressure. Short visits. Occasional conversations. No expectations beyond honesty. It wasn't what we had before, but it was real. And that mattered more. On my 66th birthday, he came to see me again. This time, he brought flowers. Real ones. Simple, beautiful, chosen with care. "Happy birthday," he said. "Thank you," I replied, taking them from him. As I placed them in a vase by the window, I noticed something unexpected. I wasn't measuring their value, not their price, not their symbolism, just the fact that they were given with intention. And that was enough. Later that evening, as I stood by the window watching the sun set over the lake, I realized something I had never fully understood before. For most of my life, I had defined myself by what I gave to others, by how much I could endure, how much I could sacrifice, how much I could carry without breaking. But I wasn't defined by that anymore. I was defined by what I chose. And now, finally, I was choosing myself.